Damian Cross had built his empire on control, of markets, of headlines, of every polished moment that appeared in glossy magazines. His name was synonymous with power, the kind that made rivals hesitate and investors nod eagerly. But as he sat in the sleek boardroom surrounded by his directors, he felt the one thing he hated most: cornered. They didn't care about his billions, not today. They cared about appearances. A single man, no matter how rich, didn't inspire trust. Stability was the word that circled the table like vultures. Stability meant a wife, a home life, a carefully curated illusion. That night, under the glow of the Manhattan skyline, Damian signed a contract more binding than any corporate merger. Across from him sat Clara Hayes, a woman who carried herself with quiet fire even as she looked out of place in his penthouse office. Her dress was simple, not the designer armor he was used to. She didn't fidget. She didn't smile. She held his gaze, steady and unflinching, as if daring him to underestimate her. "This isn't love," Damian said, his voice clipped and precise. "It's an arrangement. I need the appearance of a wife, and you need the money. We both win." Clara's jaw tightened. She had repeated those same words to herself every night since she agreed. Her family's estate, the Hayes house that had stood for 3 generations, was collapsing under debt and legal threats. Her father's illness had drained what little remained of their fortune. When the offer came, humiliating as it was also the only way to keep her family's name alive. "I'm not blind," Clara answered softly, though her tone carried steel. "I know what this is." Her words hung in the air, brittle and sharp. Damian leaned back in his chair, his suit jacket falling open as though he were the king surveying a servant. Yet something in Clara's expression unsettled him. Most women he met bent under the weight of his wealth, softened their voices or sweetened their smiles. Clara's eyes, a stormy shade of gray, didn't bend at all. They looked at him as though he were just another man, not a headline. "Then we understand each other," he said finally. "Appearances only, no illusions." The papers slid across the table. Clara hesitated, not because of doubt but because of what signing meant, surrendering her independence for her family's survival. Her hand trembled just once before the pen scratched her name in black ink. With that sound, she became Mrs. Damian Cross, not a wife in love, but a symbol, a shield for his reputation. Afterward, he escorted her to the waiting car with mechanical politeness. "You'll move into the penthouse tomorrow. Staff will prepare your rooms." "Rooms?" she repeated, a trace of bitterness curling at the edge of her lips. "Separate wings," he clarified, his tone devoid of emotion. "This is a business contract, Clara. Nothing more." The ride was silent, but Clara's thoughts roared. Every passing streetlight illuminated the truth of her decision. She had traded freedom for security, her heart for her father's peace of mind. To Damian, she was a solution. To herself, she was a pawn on a chessboard she never chose to play. Yet beneath the sharp lines of his jaw and the icy precision of his words, she caught glimpses of something hidden. The stiffness in his shoulders, the way his hand lingered too long against the glass when he thought no one watched. Damian Cross might command the world, but there was an emptiness in him, one that no headline or staged smile could disguise, and Clara, despite her vow to feel nothing, sensed that emptiness. It terrified her. Because even pawns, when placed on the right square, could change the game. The mansion was as silent as a cathedral when Clara stepped through its towering doors for the first time. The marble floors gleamed under her heels, the chandeliers sparkled like frozen constellations, and yet the air carried no warmth. It was beauty without life, a home built for magazines rather than for living. Every surface felt untouchable, as though even the sunlight was rehearsed before entering. A maid led her down a hallway that seemed endless, portraits of stern men watching from gilded frames. At the far end, double doors opened to reveal her assigned rooms. They were larger than the entire Hayes estate, furnished in silk and velvet, the kind of luxury that should have stolen her breath. Instead, it suffocated her. The bed looked too perfect to disturb, the curtains too heavy to draw back. It was a gilded cage, and she had just locked herself inside. Night fell quickly, the city lights burning outside her windows while the mansion inside remained dark and still. Clara lay awake, listening. That was when she heard it, the soft, steady rhythm of footsteps echoing faintly through the halls. Not hurried, not cautious, but restless. She slipped from the bed and moved quietly to the door, pressing her ear to the wood. The sound grew sharper. Damien Cross, the man who had signed her into this life, was pacing. She opened her door just enough to see him passing down the hallway, his tie loosened, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion. He walked with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze fixed on nothing. He looked less like a conqueror of empires and more like a prisoner pacing a cell. "Do you always stalk the corridors like a ghost?" Clara's voice broke the silence before she could stop herself. Damien turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted after a pause, as if the words were a confession ripped from him. "Maybe that's what happens when you turn your home into a museum," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "There's no life here, just echoes." For a heartbeat he looked startled, then his expression hardened again. "You're here to fill a role, Clara, not to redecorate my philosophy." But she stepped into the hallway anyway, her nightdress trailing softly across the polished floor. "I'm here because you wanted someone to stand beside you so the world would stop asking questions. That's all this is to you, isn't it? Appearances?" "Yes." His answer was cold and immediate. "And appearances matter more than anything else." Her gaze lingered on him, on the weary lines etched into his face despite his carefully pressed suit. "Then tell me why you look like a man who hasn't slept in years." Damien's jaw tightened, but he didn't reply. Instead, he brushed past her, the scent of sandalwood and whiskey trailing in his wake. "Go back to your room, Clara. This isn't your concern." She watched him disappear into the shadows of the mansion. The echo of his footsteps slowly faded, but the unease they left behind clung to her. She had thought herself the pawn in his game, but something told her Damien Cross was not as untouchable as he wanted the world to believe. As she slipped back into her room, Clara couldn't shake the thought that her marriage of appearances had already begun to reveal cracks, and within those cracks, something darker and far more dangerous might be hiding. The storm rolled over the city with a fury that shook the glass walls of the penthouse. Thunder cracked like cannon fire and rain lashed against the windows as though it wanted to force its way inside. Clara sat upright in bed, unable to sleep, her pulse quickening with every flash of lightning. Somewhere down the hall she heard it again, the sound of Damien's restless pacing. Only this time it didn't stop. She rose, her bare feet whispering across the cold floor, and followed the faint trail of sound. The mansion felt alive in the stormlight, shadows leaping and curling against the walls. She found him at the end of the corridor in front of a set of heavy wooden doors she hadn't noticed before. He was standing still at last, his head bowed, his hand pressed flat against the polished wood as though trying to draw strength from it. Clara hesitated, but her voice carried anyway. "What's in there?" Damien's shoulders tensed. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he opened the door, and the answer spilled into the hall. The room beyond was nothing like the sterile perfection of the mansion. It was raw, lived in, cluttered. A grand piano stood in the center, its surface littered with sheet music worn soft by use. Books stacked on the floor, a bottle of whiskey half empty on the side table, sketches pinned carelessly to the wall. The air smelled faintly of sandalwood and dust, but also of something fragile, something human. Without a word, Damien crossed the room and sat at the piano. His hands hovered over the keys, trembling as though they weren't his own. Then he began to play. The notes poured out, low and aching, a melody so mournful it made Clara's throat tighten. He wasn't the ruthless tycoon the world worshipped in that moment. He was a son grieving, a man unraveling. Clara stepped closer, drawn in despite herself. "You hide this from everyone?" she whispered. Damien's fingers stilled. His eyes, shadowed and tired, lifted to hers. "Music belonged to my mother. She said it healed her. After she died, I couldn't touch it without breaking, but some nights it's the only way I can breathe." The storm raged louder outside, but inside the room the only storm was between them. Clara's hand moved instinctively to the edge of the piano, her fingers brushing against his. The contact sent a current through the air, fragile but undeniable. For the first time since their marriage, she saw a crack in his armor, and for the first time she didn't feel like just a pawn. She felt like she had stumbled into the heart of a man who didn't know how to ask for help. Damien pulled his hand back, almost violently, as if the touch burned him. "Don't mistake this for anything more than it is," he warned, his voice rougher than before. "We had an agreement. Remember that." Clara drew in a breath, steadying herself. "Agreements can't keep out storms, Damien, and they can't stop you from needing someone." A flash of lightning illuminated his face, hard lines softened by something he couldn't name. For one terrifying moment he looked as though he might close the space between them. Then he turned away, striking another chord to drown out the silence. Clara left the room with her heart hammering. She had glimpsed the truth behind his sleepless nights, and it was both a weapon and a warning. Damien Cross was not the unshakable man he claimed to be, and she was no longer sure if her presence in his world would save him or destroy them both. The morning after the storm, the mansion was alive with preparations. Designers, photographers, and publicists streamed through the hallways like a parade of polished masks. Tonight was the charity gala, the first time Damien and Clara would step into the spotlight together as husband and wife. For Damien, it was strategy. For Clara, it was exposure she had never wanted. The moment she descended the staircase, whispers followed her. The gown Damien's team had chosen clung to her like a secret, emerald silk against her pale skin, her hair swept into a crown of loose curls. She looked nothing like the woman who had signed away her freedom weeks ago. She looked like a queen forced onto a throne. Damien was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, dressed in his customary black, a living sculpture of control. His eyes traveled over her, cool at first, then warmer than he intended. "You clean up well," he muttered, though the tightness in his voice betrayed more than he wanted to admit. At the gala, cameras flashed like lightning, and the murmur of voices swelled as the crowd parted to welcome them. Damien's hand rested at Clara's back, the perfect image of a devoted husband. Yet every time her laughter caught the attention of another man, a flicker of tension rippled through his grip. He told himself it was part of the performance, but the jealousy simmering beneath his calm exterior felt far too real. Clara, meanwhile, carried herself with unexpected poise. She navigated the crowd with quiet confidence, meeting questions with smiles that never revealed the truth. She had spent her life defending her family's honor. Tonight, she defended her own. Still, behind every polite laugh, she could feel the weight of eyes watching, measuring, doubting. Halfway through the evening, a murmur rippled through the crowd. A reporter clutched a tablet, her face pale with the urgency of Briar's. Eking news. Clara followed the movement, her stomach knotting as guests began whispering louder. Damien's assistant slipped him a phone, his expression hardening as he read the headline blazing across the screen. Scandal erupted. A photo of Damien, blurred but unmistakable, in the company of a mysterious woman. The article hinted at betrayal, questioning the validity of his sudden marriage. Gasps fluttered like moths through the ballroom, and all eyes shifted to Clara. She froze under the weight of it, every camera waiting for her reaction. Damien's jaw clenched, his arm tightening around her waist as though shielding her from a blow. He leaned down, his whisper sharp against her ear. "Smile, Clara. Don't let them see a crack." She did as he asked, forcing her lips into a smile so controlled it nearly broke her. Together they faced the sea of flashing cameras, but inside Clara's chest, something snapped. If the world believed Damien capable of such secrets, then what else might he be hiding from her? The night ended with a perfect performance, but when they returned to the mansion, the silence was thick with unspoken accusations. Clara turned to him, her eyes flashing with anger. "Tell me it isn't true." Damien stared back, his face unreadable. "It doesn't matter what's true. It only matters what they believe." Her heart twisted. For the first time, Clara realized that in Damien's world, truth was not a shield. It was a weakness, and she had just stepped into a life where every weakness would be used against her. The storm of scandal lingered long after the gala, Every newspaper splashed Damien's face across their front pages, every headline twisting the story of his so-called mystery woman into something more sinister. Clara tried to ignore it, but the whispers found her even in the marble halls of the mansion. Servants avoided her eyes, reporters camped outside the gates, and phone calls from her father carried an edge of fear. She had stepped into Damien's world, but now the fire was burning her too. One night, unable to bear the suffocating silence of her wing, Clara wandered through the darkened halls. The storm clouds from days before had returned, casting the city in flashes of silver and shadow. She followed the faintest sound, a melody barely audible over the rain. It drew her to a set of doors she had seen once before, the place where Damien had revealed his secret. She hesitated, then pushed the door open. He was there, seated at the piano, his fingers gliding across the keys as though trying to empty his soul into the music. The melody was unlike anything she had heard, angry, desperate, fractured. He stopped abruptly when he noticed her, his hands curling into fists against the ivory. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low, almost hoarse. "Neither should you," she replied, stepping into the room. "You bury yourself in this music like it's the only place you can breathe." His eyes locked onto hers, something raw flickering in their depths. "It is the only place." Clara crossed the room slowly, her pulse racing. She touched the edge of the piano, then pressed a single key, letting the note linger in the air between them. "You don't have to play alone." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Damien's mask cracked just enough for her to see the man beneath, the man who carried grief like a second skin, who couldn't sleep without drowning in melody. Yes. Her hand brushed against his on the keys, and this time he didn't pull away. The heat of his skin startled her, a jolt that traveled straight to her chest. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Rain pounded the windows, thunder rolled, and yet the world seemed to hold its breath. Damien leaned closer, his eyes searching hers as though asking a question he couldn't voice. Clara's heart raced, every instinct warning her to step back, but something deeper urged her forward. Their lips nearly touched before he forced himself away, rising from the piano as if the bench had caught fire. "This changes nothing," he said sharply, his back turned to her. "We had an agreement." Clara stood, her voice trembling with equal parts anger and longing. "You keep hiding behind that word as if it will protect you. But agreements don't explain why you can't sleep. Agreements don't explain why you look at me like this." His silence was louder than any denial. He reached for the whiskey bottle, pouring it with hands that shook more than he wanted her to see. Clara left the room before her own heart betrayed her, but not before she noticed the sheet of paper lying on the piano. Anonymous words scrawled in dark ink. "She's not the first. She won't be the last." The handwriting was jagged, almost threatening. Clara's breath caught. Someone else knew their secret. Someone wanted to poison whatever fragile thread tied her to Damien, and she feared that if Damien didn't admit his truth soon, the world would tear them both apart. The mansion was restless that night, as if the walls themselves sensed a secret lurking within them. Clara lay awake in her vast bed staring at the ceiling when she heard the faint creak of footsteps again. Damien was walking the halls, but his pace was heavier, more urgent, each step echoing like a warning. She slipped from her sheets and followed the sound until she found him in the library, the firelight flickering against his face. He held a letter in his hand, his knuckles white from the grip. Without looking at her, he spoke. "They know more than they should. Whoever is sending these messages, they're not guessing. They're watching us." Clara stepped closer, her heart thudding. "Let me see." He hesitated before passing the paper to her. The handwriting was the same jagged scrawl she had seen before. The words were sharper this time. "She's not the first, and she won't be the last. He will break you like he broke the others." The weight of it made Clara's stomach twist. "Others? What does this mean? Damien, what aren't you telling me?" His jaw tightened as he poured himself another drink. "It means someone wants to destroy me, and they'll use you to do it." She watched him drain the glass, his shoulders slumping for the first time since she had known him. Beneath his armor of power and control, he looked like a man unraveling. Clara wanted to demand answers, but her voice softened instead. You can't keep shutting me out. If we're to face this, we have to face it together. Damien finally turned to her, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights and too much whiskey. Together. That word doesn't exist in my world, Clara. People close to me always get hurt. That's why I don't let anyone close. His confession stung, but before she could reply, the storm outside cracked with thunder. The room shook and the power flickered. In the half-darkness, Damien suddenly looked older. How? Ended. Clara crossed the room without thinking and placed her hand gently on his chest. His breath caught, his body tense, but he didn't pull away. You're not alone anymore, she whispered. For the first time in years, Damien felt the weight in his chest ease. His eyes closed as he leaned into her touch. The firelight danced across their faces as if the house itself had paused to witness the fragile moment. Clara felt his heartbeat steady under her palm, and as she stood there, he seemed to collapse into the simplest truth. He could only rest when she was near. Later, as the storm quieted, Clara found herself lying beside him on the couch, his arm heavy around her waist. Damien Cross, the man who ruled empires, was finally asleep, his breathing deep and even. She stared at him in the dim light, torn between fear and tenderness. Because she knew now what the letters meant. Someone was watching, waiting, feeding poison into their fragile bond. And if Damien's enemies learned he could only sleep when she touched him, then she was no longer just a pawn in appearances. She was his weakness, and that made her a target. The morning light spilled through the tall windows, but it brought no peace. Damien sat at the long dining table, the newspaper spread in front of him like a weapon. Across the front page was their marriage certificate, leaked in perfect detail, proof that their union had been a contract from the start. The words were merciless. Sham marriage. Cross deceives investors and public alike. Clara stood frozen in the doorway as she read the headline over his shoulder. Her heart dropped into her stomach. Who would do this? Damien folded the paper with deliberate calm, but his jaw flexed in barely contained rage. Someone who wants me ruined, and they don't care if you burn with me. She walked to the table, her eyes blazing. You told me this was about appearances, that no one would ever know. Now the entire city thinks I'm just a prop in your performance. You are not a prop. His voice cracked sharper than he intended. You are. He stopped himself, pressing his fingers to his temples. You were never supposed to be dragged into this mess. I should have known they'd find a way. Clara's chest ached at his words. He couldn't even finish the sentence, couldn't admit what she already suspected, that he felt more than he wanted to. But his silence cut deeper than the scandal. By evening, the mansion was under siege. Reporters lined the gates, their shouts carrying across the courtyard. Investors demanded explanations. Board members called every hour, and Clara could feel the weight of eyes on her wherever she turned. She couldn't escape the whispers, the flashes of cameras when she dared peek through the curtains. When Damien finally found her in the music room, she was clutching one of the threatening notes. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her voice trembling with fury. Is this what my life is now? Damien's secrets, leaks, threats. You said this was business, but I am the one, Bilas, eating for it. He stepped toward her, his expression torn. I told you not to get close. I told you this would destroy you, but you wouldn't stay away. Because I'm not a mannequin, you can pose for photographs. I'm a person, and whether you want to admit it or not, you've made me part of your war. The storm outside had begun again, wind battering the windows, as though the city itself mirrored their unrest. Damien reached out as if to touch her, but stopped short, his hand hovering in the air. I don't want to lose you. The words were raw, unguarded, as if torn straight from his chest. Clara's breath hitched, but before she could reply, the shrill ring of his phone cut through the room. He answered, and his face hardened instantly. The board had called an emergency meeting. They were demanding his resignation if he couldn't prove the marriage was real. He ended the call and looked at her, his eyes dark with decision. This is it, Clara. They're forcing me to choose. My empire, or you. The storm raged louder, lightning splitting the sky as the truth settled between them. The marriage that began as an arrangement was now a battlefield, and the next move could cost them everything. The boardroom felt like a courtroom when Damien walked in. Suits lined the long table, their eyes sharp and cold, every one of them waiting for his downfall. The leaked contract lay projected on the screen behind them, a damning reminder that his perfect facade had shattered. Clara sat quietly at his side, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her pulse thundering in her ears. She was not supposed to be here, but Damien had insisted. If the marriage was on trial, she had to face the fire with him. One of the older board members leaned forward, his voice dripping with contempt. "You manipulated shareholders. You presented stability when in reality this was nothing more than a purchased arrangement. Do you have any defense, Mr. Cross?" Damien's jaw was steel. "My personal life has never affected my performance. This company has thrived under my leadership. That is my defense." The room buzzed with murmurs. Another voice cut through. "Then prove it. Prove that this marriage is not the sham the press claims it to be." Clara's chest tightened. Damien had built an empire on control, yet now his fate depended on proving that something born out of contract had turned into something real. She looked at him, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. His silence was louder than any lie. When the meeting ended, they left through the back exit to avoid the swarm of reporters. In the car, Clara finally broke. "You let them think I was nothing more than a pawn. You didn't deny it. You didn't fight for me." Damien's hand clenched around the steering wheel. "If I fought for you, it would only prove them right. They'd call it a desperate performance. Everything I say can and will be twisted." Her throat burned. "Then what am I to you, Damien? A shield. A mask. A distraction." His knuckles whitened, but his voice stayed even. "You are the reason I still stand, but that is not something I can put in a heddle in." Clara turned away from him, tears blurring the city lights. She had believed his walls were crumbling, that the nights at the piano and the stolen touches meant something more. But if he couldn't even name her in front of the people who wanted to destroy him, then maybe she had been wrong. That night, she packed her bags. The mansion seemed to hold its breath as she closed the doors of her room, her footsteps echoing down the silent hall. Damien stood at the window of his study watching the storm clouds roll in again, his reflection fractured against the glass. He heard the sound of the car pulling away, but he didn't stop it. He told himself it was to protect her, that by letting her go he was shielding her from the war closing in around him. But as the taillights disappeared into the night, Damien felt the weight of the truth settle in his chest. For the first time in his life, the empire he built meant nothing, because without Clara beside him, the mansion was only stone and silence, and no amount of power could quiet the darkness waiting for him when sleep refused to come. The days after Clara's departure were a blur of smoke and mirrors. Damien moved through his empire like a ghost, his presence sharp, but his spirit fractured. The press tore at him, headlines grew uglier, and whispers of a hostile takeover spread through the corridors of Cross Enterprises. He locked himself in meetings, his insomnia worse than ever, his temper snapping at even the smallest flaw. But beneath the fury lay fear. Without Clara, the nights were unbearable. He had not slept more than a handful of hours since the moment she left. One evening, his investigator returned with a folder, thick with surveillance photos and financial records. Damien flipped through them, his stomach turning colder with every page. His rival was not a stranger. It was Elias Cross, his own cousin, a man who had long lingered in the shadows of his success. Elias had orchestrated the leaks, bribed reporters, even fabricated the photo of Damien with the so-called mystery woman. The marriage contract had been stolen straight from the legal archives by Elias's hired men. Damien's fury ignited, but beneath it was a sharper pain. Elias wasn't just trying to ruin his company. He was targeting Clara, dragging her into a storm she never asked for. Damien clenched the folder until his knuckles ached. His cousin wanted blood, and he had chosen the one person Damien could not afford to lose. That night, Damien sat at the piano, the keys cold under his fingertips. He hadn't touched it since Clara left. The silence of the house pressed down on him, and for the first time he admitted what he had denied for weeks. He needed her. Not for the board, not for appearances, not even for sleep. He needed her because she had become the only part of his life that felt real. Meanwhile, Clara was back at the Hayes estate, tending to her father and trying to rebuild her fractured pride. But the quiet she longed for refused to come. Every paper she opened carried Damien's name. Every whisper in the village market carried judgment. Worse still, an unmarked envelope had been delivered to her door. Inside was a photo of her at the gala, Damien's arm around her waist, his eyes fixed on her with something that was not business. On the back of the photo were words scrawled in that same jagged hand. "You'll regret ever loving him." Clara's hands shook as she held it. She had never admitted it aloud, but the truth burned inside her. She had fallen for Damien, despite every warning, despite every wall he had built, and now her heart had made her a target. As midnight fell, Damien made his decision. He would no longer let Elias pull the strings. If the world wanted to see his marriage tested, then he would show them the truth, even if it cost him his empire. He picked up the phone and arranged a press conference, one that would shake the city to its core. But Elias was already moving his final piece, hidden in the shadows of Manhattan's power games. He prepared the revelation that would cut deeper than any scandal so far. Clara's bloodline was no accident. Damien's mother had left a clause in her will, a condition Elias was ready to expose, a condition that would twist Damien's love into a trap he never saw coming. The ballroom where Damien chose to face the world was crowded with reporters, cameras flashing like a storm of lightning. His empire teetered on the edge of collapse, his reputation shredded by leaks and lies, but his voice was steady as he stepped to the podium. Clara was not beside him. He had not seen her since the night she left, but her absence weighed heavier than all the eyes upon him. He began without preamble. "Yes, our marriage began as an arrangement, a contract born out of pressure and appearances. But what no one understands is that it did not stay that way. Somewhere, between silence and storm, between scandal and truth, I found the only thing I never expected. I found her, and I cannot breathe. I cannot sleep. I cannot exist without her." The room erupted with shouts, reporters hurling questions, cameras devouring every flicker of his expression. He let them roar because for the first time he had stopped hiding. But then a new voice cut through the chaos, sharp and theatrical. Elias Cross stepped into the spotlight with a smile carved from cruelty. "You all want the truth," Elias announced, lifting a folder high. "Then hear the part Damien refuses to tell. Clara Hayes was never chosen at random. Their marriage was written long before they met. The screen behind them lit with documents, his mother's will. The words were simple but devastating. Damien's inheritance of Cross Enterprises was conditional. He could only inherit if he married someone from the Hayes bloodline, the family his mother had once trusted above all others. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Elias's smile widened. He didn't just marry for appearances, he married because he had no choice. Damien's face hardened, but his heart twisted. He looked out over the crowd and saw Clara standing at the edge of the room, pale with shock. Her eyes met his, and the betrayal in them pierced deeper than Elias's words. She turned as if to leave, but Damien's voice broke through. "No," he said, his tone raw and thunderous. "Yes, my mother set this condition. Yes, I began this marriage for the wrong reasons. But every step since then has been my choice. I could have kept Clara at a distance. I could have let the contract be nothing but paper. But I didn't. Because Clara is not my inheritance. She is my truth." The room fell silent. Damien stepped down from the podium, ignoring the shouts, and crossed to where Clara stood. Every camera swung to follow. He stopped before her, his voice low enough for only her to hear, though the microphones caught every word. "I cannot erase the way this began. But I can tell you this. You are not my pawn, Clara. You are the reason I can finally close my eyes at night. You are the only part of me that is real. If I lose everything today, I will not regret it as long as I do not lose you." Clara's tears burned hot against her cheeks. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but instead she whispered the truth she had fought so hard to deny. "You broke every rule I lived by, Damien, and still I can't stop loving you. The cameras flashed, the board watched in stunned silence, and Elias's smirk faltered. Clara stepped into Damien's arms, her head resting against his chest. The city witnessed it. The scandal, the confession, the undeniable bond. In that moment, the empire might have been slipping through Damien's fingers, but he no longer cared. For the first time in his life, he was not fighting for appearances. He was fighting for love. And as the noise of the crowd rose like thunder, Clara tightened her grip on him, whispering the words that set him free. Then let them watch. Because this time, Damien, we play by our own rules. And when his eyes closed that night for the first time in years, he slept without fear. Because she was there. And no empire, no rival, no secret could take her touch away.